France, November 1944. Cold rain drizzled endlessly across the broken countryside. Mud swallowed boots, trucks, and horses alike. A thick, unrelenting sea of brown that turned every road into a grave for machines. On a ridge above the valley, a group of German officers stood beside their immobilized Panther tank. Cigarettes glowed faintly in the gloom as they watched the scene below. Across the field, an American column struggled forward. Hundreds of M4 Sherman tanks, engines growling under the weight of mud and rain. The Germans laughed. To them, these American machines were crude toys, poorly armored, undergunned, and built too quickly to last. They joked that the mud would finish what their cannons could not. But as the hours passed, something unexpected happened. The Shermans didn't stop. One after another, they rolled, slipped, spun, and kept moving. Mechanics worked knee-deep in freezing sludge, repairing broken treads in minutes. Tanks that should have died in the mud simply refused to. The laughter faded. Because this was how America fought wars. The Second World War was not only a clash of nations and ideologies, it was a brutal contest of machines. By 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe had begun in full. The beaches of Normandy were secured, but the real struggle was inland, across the fields, forests, and rivers of France. It was there, beyond the glamour of D-Day, that a new kind of war emerged, a war of endurance, logistics, and reliability. The Germans entered this phase with supreme confidence in their engineering. Their tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, were mechanical marvels. Each was crafted with precision and armor that seemed invincible to anything the Allies possessed. To a German officer, a tank was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of industrial pride, an extension of the nation's obsession with mechanical perfection. Yet perfection came at a cost. The Tiger I, with its 80 mm gun, could destroy a Sherman at over 2 kilometers. But it required constant maintenance, consumed enormous amounts of fuel, and often broke down after a single day's operation. Its overlapping road wheels froze in winter. Its transmission failed under strain, and its sheer weight made recovery almost impossible once mired in mud. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans approached warfare differently. Their military leaders, from Eisenhower to the Ordnance Department engineers, believed that the key to victory wasn't the best tank, but the one that could be built by the thousands, maintained by mechanics in the field, and repaired with the simplest tools imaginable. That philosophy gave birth to the M4 Sherman. Introduced in 1942, the Sherman was the embodiment of American practicality. Its 75 mm gun was adequate, its armor was decent, and its speed was reliable. But its real strength lay beneath the surface, the ease with which it could be repaired, replaced, and modified. Every Sherman used standardized parts, engines, transmissions, treads, all interchangeable, all mass-produced. By 1944, more than 40,000 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines. Each one carried the spirit of an industrial nation that had retooled its car factories, steel mills, and shipyards to produce war machines at an unimaginable pace. German officers couldn't understand it. They looked at the Sherman's thin armor, its high profile, its relatively small gun, and laughed. To them, it was proof that Americans didn't understand tank warfare. But the laughter came from a place of arrogance, because what they didn't realize was that the Sherman wasn't designed for dueling. It was designed for moving. It was designed for staying alive. It was a tank meant not for glory, but for momentum. And in war, momentum was everything. As the Allied advance pushed deeper into France, this philosophy began to show its worth. The roads were few, the bridges destroyed, and the fields turned into quagmires after weeks of rain. German panzers, superior on paper, sat crippled for lack of spare parts or fuel. American mechanics, meanwhile, worked miracles in the mud. Engines were replaced in the open, Treads were repaired under fire, and damaged tanks were cannibalized to bring others back to life. Shermans that had been disabled in the morning were back in action by nightfall. Entire armored divisions, thought to be halted by weather, were somehow advancing again by dawn. Behind this miracle was not luck, but planning. A deliberate design of American doctrine. The U.S. Army's strength was not in a single tank, but in the system that kept those tanks running. It was a network of logistics, supply, and improvisation that turned the Sherman into something greater than a machine. It became a symbol of industrial resilience. And while German engineers built masterpieces of steel, American mechanics built endurance. That endurance was about to be tested like never before. To understand how the Sherman came to embody American industrial might, one must go back to the early years of the war, long before Normandy, before the mud, before the laughter of German officers echoed across France. In 1940, as Europe burned, the United States watched from across the Atlantic. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads had already crushed Poland and France, showcasing the terrifying efficiency of blitzkrieg. The lesson was unmistakable. The age of the tank had arrived. When the U.S. Army studied these campaigns, it realized that it lacked not only modern armor but also a doctrine to use it. The interwar years had left America's armored force divided between traditionalists and visionaries. Some officers believed tanks should merely support infantry. Others, men like George S. Patton and Adna R. Chaffee, argued that armor was the new cavalry, meant to break through and exploit speed. Out of this debate rose a pragmatic answer. Build a tank that could do everything adequately, rather than a few things perfectly. That idea shaped the M4 Sherman. It wasn't revolutionary. It was reliable, flexible, and, most importantly, producible in enormous quantities. In 1941, when the U.S. officially entered the war, America's automotive giants mobilized with breathtaking speed. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler turned their factories from sedans to steel monsters. At the Detroit Arsenal tank plant alone, workers rolled out Shermans every few minutes, a feat no European power could match. Unlike German factories, where skilled craftsmen assembled tanks by hand, American production lines relied on standardization. Every bolt, every engine, every turret ring followed a unified specification. This meant a Sherman built in California could be repaired in France with parts shipped from Pennsylvania. It meant that any mechanic, whether trained or improvised, could bring a broken tank back to life. This philosophy extended far beyond factories. The U.S. Army's Logistics Corps ensured that spare parts, fuel, and ammunition flowed across continents. Liberty ships carried tanks in modular form, assembled near the front. Field depots sprang up like industrial oases, where engines were swapped and transmissions rebuilt in the open air. For the Americans, the battlefield was not a static line of trenches, but a living, breathing system of supply and repair. It was this system that made the Sherman a weapon of endurance. German intelligence noticed it early. Reports from the Eastern Front and North Africa mentioned the uncanny ability of American units to recover and redeploy damaged tanks. By 1943, in Tunisia, the Africa Corps was already facing Shermans that refused to die. German field officers mocked their appearance but feared their persistence. The contrast in philosophy could not have been sharper. The German Tiger was an apex predator, powerful but rare, magnificent but fragile. The Sherman was a wolf pack, smaller, faster, and endlessly replaceable. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the difference had become strategic. The Germans fielded fewer than 2,000 Panthers and Tigers on the Western Front. The Allies brought over 11,000 Shermans. Each day, more arrived. The terrain of northern France soon became the ultimate test ground for these opposing doctrines. The hedgerows of Normandy and the open plains beyond punished mechanical weakness and rewarded adaptability. German tank units struggled to repair complex vehicles under pressure. American mechanics, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, often under shell fire, to keep the armored columns moving. It wasn't just a difference in machines, it was a difference in mindset. To the Germans, engineering was an art. To the Americans, it was a service. The goal wasn't perfection, it was performance. And in war, performance meant survival. As the autumn rains came and France turned to mud, the true meaning of this difference became clear. While the mighty Tigers sank and broke, the Shermans, with their wider tracks, lighter frames, and simple designs, pushed on. Their engines roared through the sludge, their mechanics knee-deep in muck, patching together steel and oil into motion once more. It was here, in the mud and misery of 1944, that German laughter would turn to silence. Because the Americans weren't fighting for elegance. They were fighting to move forward, no matter what stood in their way. And soon, the world would witness the proof. The human angle. The mechanics. Behind the miracle war stories often glorified the generals and the guns, but behind every Sherman that kept rolling through France stood a quiet army. The mechanics. These men weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't charge through machine gun fire or storm enemy trenches. Their battleground was the mud. Their weapon was the wrench. In the weeks after D-Day, American armored divisions pushed through terrain so hostile it broke machines faster than bullets could. Engines overheated, treads snapped, suspensions cracked. And yet, day after day, the Shermans returned to the fight. The reason? Mechanics who refused to surrender to the elements. They worked in freezing rain, sleeves rolled up, hands blistered from steel and oil. Tanks arrived on transporters mangled and burning, only to emerge again the next morning, patched, repainted, ready. They were the backbone of the American advance. Entire field depots became mechanical cities, engines on racks, welding torches flickering like fireflies in the night. Soldiers said you could tell where the Americans had been by the smell of grease and gasoline in the air. It wasn't luck that kept the Shermans moving. It was the doctrine of field repairability, a concept so deeply embedded in the U.S. Army's mindset that spare parts traveled almost as fast as ammunition, while German repair units struggled to fix complex transmissions and specialized armor. American mechanics swapped out entire powertrains in the open, using cranes made from scavenged timber. The difference was night and day. One army admired mechanical purity, the other mastered improvisation. And it was this human resilience, the quiet determination of ordinary men, turning broken steel into power again, that made the Sherman unstoppable. The tactical angle? The power of mobility. German tank commanders believed in the duel, in meeting an enemy head-on and outgunning him. American doctrine believed in movement. From the start, the U.S. Army designed the Sherman not as a duelist, but as part of a combined arms team. Infantry, artillery, and air power worked together to exploit what the Sherman did best: move fast, hit hard enough, and keep going. Where the Tiger and Panther required carefully chosen ground, the Sherman thrived on unpredictability. Its lighter frame allowed it to cross bridges that would collapse under a Panther's weight. Its wider tracks gave it better traction in mud. And when one broke down, which they inevitably did, recovery crews could haul it out within hours. Mobility was more than speed. It was adaptability. Shermans were fitted with bulldozer blades to clear debris, Calliope rocket launchers to blast fortified positions, and even flotation screens for amphibious assaults. No other tank in the war changed roles so easily. German commanders couldn't comprehend it. They expected tanks to be purpose-built for specific missions. The Americans treated theirs like platforms. One foundation, endless possibilities. By late 1944, This philosophy had turned into a strategic advantage. Patton's Third Army was a storm of motion, advancing across Europe at a pace that stunned both friend and foe. His tanks didn't win by firepower alone. They won by never stopping. Every mile gained was a testament to the Sherman's mechanical reliability and the logistical machine behind it. The Germans had the better gun. The Americans had the better system. And that system, one of repair, refuel, redeploy, would prove deadlier than any cannon. The technological angle. Simplicity as superiority in the race for battlefield dominance. The Germans pursued complexity. The Americans pursued efficiency. The Sherman's brilliance wasn't hidden in advanced technology. It was in the simplicity of design. Its radial gasoline engine, adapted from aircraft use, was rugged and easy to maintain. Its transmission could be replaced in the field. Its suspension, the vertical volet spring system, absorbed rough terrain without breaking down. Where the Tiger demanded master mechanics and precision parts, the Sherman invited adaptation. Crews customized their tanks with improvised armor, sandbags, and logs. Engineers created variants for every purpose: recovery tanks, mine-clearing tanks, flamethrowers, bridge layers. Standardization turned innovation into a weapon. If a new improvement worked on one Sherman, it could be applied to thousands overnight. Factories back home could modify blueprints without halting production, something the Germans never managed with their over-engineered machines. This made the Sherman more than a vehicle. It was a modular system, a living organism that evolved with the war itself. By contrast, German tank production was crippled by specialization. Each model required unique parts, unique tools, and highly trained labor. The results were beautiful machines. But in a war of attrition, beauty broke. The American system, imperfect as it was, survived the chaos. Shermans could be rebuilt faster than Panthers could be designed. For every Tiger rolling off a German line, 10 Shermans emerged from American factories, each one easier to maintain, each one ready to roll into battle. That was the secret. Not brilliance, not superiority, but relentless, efficient functionality. And while the Germans mocked that simplicity, it was that very simplicity that would roll over them, in waves of mud, steel, and perseverance. The leadership angle. Patton's doctrine of relentless motion, General George S. Patton understood one truth about mechanized warfare. Momentum is victory. To him, a tank that stood still was already dead. His commands to his armored divisions were simple: keep moving, keep fighting, keep the enemy off balance. Patton didn't idolize the Sherman's technical qualities. He knew its weaknesses: the thin armor, the limited gun, the vulnerability to German 88s. But he also knew that it could move. He trusted it the way a cavalryman trusted his horse. The Sherman, to Patton, was not a dueling champion. It was a charger meant to flank, to encircle, to keep the enemy reeling. He once wrote in his field notes, "Fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of man." He believed the same about overcomplicated machines. To him, the German Tiger was a fortress on tracks. Powerful, yes, but destined to stall. The Sherman, in contrast, was a raider, a hunter that fed on speed. Patton's armored columns became legends. His units advanced hundreds of miles across France and Germany in mere weeks, something no other general on the continent could match. The secret wasn't the Sherman's gun. It was the doctrine of continuous momentum. He pushed his logistics officers as hard as his tank crews, demanding that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flow as fast as his advancing tanks. He created what became known as the Red Ball Express, a lifeline of trucks that ran day and night, carrying supplies to the front. It was here that the full design of the Sherman proved prophetic. Its fuel compatibility, easy maintenance, and interchangeable parts allowed Patton's men to stay ahead of the German retreat. His divisions didn't pause to repair. They repaired while advancing. To the Germans, this was madness. To the Americans, it was doctrine. The enemy angle, German realizations in the field, by late 1944, reports from German tank units began to reveal a shift in tone. The arrogance was fading. The laughter was gone. Commanders in the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions had begun to realize that their superior machines were losing the larger battle. Not through defeat in combat, but through exhaustion. One after-action report from the 2nd SS Panzer Division described American tanks that returned to the fight within hours of destruction. Another report from the 5th Panzer Army lamented that Americans replace machines faster than we can destroy them. German mechanics struggled to service their own vehicles. Panthers, rushed into mass production in 1943, suffered from weak final drives and fragile transmissions. Even minor damage could immobilize them for days. Spare parts were scarce, and fuel shortages crippled entire units. Meanwhile, the Shermans, crude, ugly, and unrefined in German eyes, simply refused to die. Even when burned out or blown apart, many were stripped for usable components and rebuilt. The American system made it so that a destroyed Sherman was not the end of a tank. It was the beginning of another. By the winter of 1944, German officers began to voice their frustration in captured diaries and intelligence intercepts. One officer wrote bitterly, "They fight with factories, not tanks." He was right. The battlefield had become a reflection of two philosophies. The Germans fought with precision and craftsmanship. The Americans fought with systems, repair depots, supply lines, mechanics, and standardization. And in modern war, systems win the moral, industrial angle. America's arsenal of democracy. The Sherman wasn't just a machine of war. It was the physical embodiment of a nation's will to produce, to adapt, and to fight on all fronts. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had promised that the United States would become the arsenal of democracy, and nowhere was that promise more visible than in the Sherman tank. Across the country, factories worked around the clock. Steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Detroit, optics from Massachusetts, all converged into one standardized design that could be built faster than it could be destroyed. For every German engineer who obsessed over tolerances, there were thousands of American welders, riveters, and machinists who believed that good enough and on time was better than perfect and too late. This moral confidence, this belief in collective effort, became a weapon in itself. The Sherman was not designed by one genius. It was built by millions of ordinary hands. Farmers' sons who had never seen a tank before were now driving them into battle. Factory workers who once built tractors now assembled instruments of liberation. Each Sherman rolling onto a ship represented not just a tank, but an idea that freedom, when organized and disciplined, could outproduce tyranny. By late 1944, this idea was visible everywhere on the Western Front. American armored divisions advanced not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. They knew that even if a tank broke down, another would take its place. Even if one crew fell, another would follow. And behind every track that turned through the mud, behind every engine that roared back to life, stood a factory worker, a mechanic, a nation united by the simple belief that progress could not stop. The laughter of German officers had long since faded into disbelief, because in the mud of France, it wasn't perfection that triumphed, it was persistence, and that persistence was about to face its greatest test yet. The rains came early in the autumn of 1944. France, once a sunlit patchwork of wheat and stone villages, turned into an endless expanse of mud. Tanks sank to their hulls, trucks spun helplessly, even horses collapsed in the fields. For most armies, this was the season of stillness, the time when engines froze and wheels stopped turning. But for the Americans, it was only another problem to solve. In the heart of this chaos, the 4th Armored Division, under General George Patton, pressed toward the Moselle River. The German defenders believed the mud would halt the offensive. Their Panthers and Tigers, built for power, struggled to maneuver on the soaked terrain. Entire platoons sat immobilized, their engines choking under the weight of their own design. Then came the sound that would haunt German officers for months: the low, steady rumble of Sherman engines cutting through the rain. American columns advanced through conditions that should have stopped them cold. The Shermans slipped, skidded, and swayed. But they moved. Mechanics followed close behind, repairing thrown tracks on the spot. Tank crews carried spare bogie wheels strapped to the hulls, ready to replace a failure within minutes. The battlefield itself had become an open-air workshop. One observer from the 37th Tank Battalion recalled, "If we couldn't drive it, we fixed it. If we couldn't fix it, we built a new one from the wreck next to it." German scouts reported with disbelief that American tanks, once thought immobilized, were back in formation the next morning. What the Germans didn't grasp was that the U.S. Army didn't rely on perfect machinery. It relied on systems of men. Behind every tank company trailed convoys of fuel, spare parts, and field depots capable of resurrecting an entire armored division overnight. Patton's men embodied his creed: speed over stagnation. When the bridges over the Moselle were blown, engineers built new ones in record time. When the roads vanished into rivers of mud, bulldozers carved new paths. And when tanks bogged down, recovery vehicles hauled them out with relentless efficiency. By late November, the German High Command realized something staggering. Their best weapons were being defeated not by superior firepower, but by persistence. Their field commanders sent reports filled with frustration. American machines cannot be stopped by weather. Their mobility is unnatural. The myth of German invincibility in armor began to crack. At Nancy, the 6th Armored Division outmaneuvered a numerically superior German force by sheer speed. At Ericourt, Sherman crews used mobility and communication to destroy over 80 German tanks in just 2 days, despite being outgunned. The Panthers' long-range advantage meant little in terrain where visibility was less than 100 meters. The mud became the great equalizer, and the Sherman thrived in it. The Germans had always mocked American machines as factory toys. Yet, in the quagmire of Europe's autumn, it was those same toys that kept rolling while their steel masterpieces rusted in place. Each battle pushed the lesson deeper. The war would not be won by brilliance, but by endurance. The German officers who once laughed at the clumsy American tank now watched as their own machines were abandoned in the mire, too heavy to recover, too fragile to repair. By December, their laughter was gone, replaced by silence and by the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of the war. Because the mud, which had once been Germany's ally, had become America's proving ground. And the true test of endurance, the one that would decide the fate of the Western Front, was about to begin in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Snow fell in heavy silence, covering the wrecks of burned-out tanks and shattered trees. The German army, cornered yet desperate, launched one last gamble. Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's final attempt to break the Allied line and seize Antwerp, splitting the Western Front in two. The offensive struck with terrifying force. hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles poured into the Ardennes, taking the Allies by surprise. Fog grounded the Allied air forces, cutting off their greatest advantage. For a moment, the tide seemed to turn. But where others saw chaos, the Americans saw another challenge to overcome. In the early days of the battle, the roads vanished under snow and ice. Supply convoys froze in place. Temperatures plunged to 20 degrees. German armored spearheads, Tiger IIs, Panthers, and Stugs, pressed deep into American lines. To many observers, it looked like a disaster in motion. Yet, again, the Sherman tank and the men who maintained it would decide the outcome. In Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, American forces held their ground. Shermans, coated in frost, idled in narrow streets. Engines running constantly to keep oil from freezing. Mechanics used torches to thaw fuel lines, rebuilt engines in snowdrifts, and scavenged from wrecks to keep the line alive. Every night, the sound of hammering echoed across the frozen town, men working by lantern light to bring crippled machines back to life. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army turned north, executing one of the fastest winter maneuvers in modern history. Within days, his armored columns, spearheaded by hundreds of Shermans, advanced over terrain the Germans thought impassable. The secret was preparation. Every tank carried winterized oil, snow chains, and improvised insulation crafted by field crews weeks before. German tankers, meanwhile, faced mechanical nightmares. The heavy King Tigers burned fuel at impossible rates, often running dry before reaching the front. Their engines froze solid overnight. Mechanics lacked parts, tools, or even proper shelter to service them. Dozens of German tanks were abandoned, not because of battle damage, but because they simply could not move. The Americans, by contrast, moved constantly. In the bitter cold, logistics units worked miracles once again. The Red Ball Express, already legendary, adapted to icy roads, chaining every tire, rerouting every convoy, and driving non-stop to supply the counterattack. It was this web of relentless motion, trucks, tanks, mechanics, and repair crews, that turned the tide of the Ardennes. On December 26, 1944, Patton's lead units broke through to Bastogne. The encirclement was lifted. Shermans rolled into the snow-choked streets, engines roaring, their tracks grinding through the wreckage of the German advance. For the Wehrmacht, it was the end of illusion. The offensive that was meant to divide the Allies had instead shattered Germany's last reserves. The Tiger IIs that had once terrified Allied tankers now lay crippled by the roadside. Mechanical corpses, frozen in place. Captured German officers were astonished by what they saw. Rows of Shermans idling in the snow, being fueled, repaired, and redeployed, all within hours. One prisoner later remarked, "They fight as if their machines cannot die." He wasn't far from the truth. The Battle of the Bulge marked the moment when the world finally understood what had been unfolding all along, that America's strength lay not in perfection, but in production and perseverance. Every tank that moved forward was a testament to a system that never stopped, an industrial organism that stretched from the steel mills of Pennsylvania to the frozen woods of Belgium. The laughter that had once greeted the Sherman's arrival was long gone. In its place stood respect, and, in the hearts of German officers, something closer to dread. Because they now knew, even when nature itself turned against them, mud, snow, rain, or ice, the Americans would keep coming, and the Shermans would keep rolling. The battle ended in January 1945. The German counteroffensive had failed completely. More than 700 enemy tanks were lost, many not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdowns and fuel starvation. The Shermans, though bloodied and battered, kept moving east. they were no longer underestimated. The war was turning, and the machine that symbolized endurance was leading the charge. When the snow finally melted and the roads of Belgium and France turned back to earth, the truth of what had happened lay bare across the land. Thousands of German tanks, Tigers, Panthers, King Tigers, sat abandoned along frozen roads and forest tracks. Many had been destroyed in combat, but far more were victims of their own design. Engines seized, transmissions shattered, and fuel tanks empty. In contrast, the American armored columns, battered, scarred, but mobile, pushed forward relentlessly. The M4 Sherman, the machine so often mocked as inferior, had done something no one expected. It had endured everything. In the weeks after the Battle of the Bulge, Allied intelligence officers conducted field inspections of captured and destroyed German vehicles. The findings were stark. German tanks that looked invincible on paper had proven disastrously unreliable in the field. Spare parts were almost impossible to obtain. Many units had cannibalized one-third of their vehicles just to keep the rest running. A U.S. Army Ordnance report summarized the contrast succinctly. The German tanks are excellent weapons when they run. Ours run. That sentence, simple, factual, devastating, encapsulated the entire war of machines. For all the fear that the Tiger had inspired, it was the humble Sherman that carried the Allies across Europe. From Normandy to the Rhine, the same pattern repeated. German mechanical superiority defeated by American logistical reality. Captured German officers, interviewed after the war, admitted their astonishment. One, Oberstleutnant Karl Rothenburg, a veteran of the 2nd Panzer Division, remarked, "We destroyed hundreds of your tanks, but they always came back. Ours did not." He wasn't exaggerating. The United States could replace a destroyed Sherman in less than 2 weeks, sometimes sooner. Germany, strangled by Allied bombing and fuel shortages, could barely produce replacements at all. The battlefield statistics tell a clear story. Shermans produced over $49,000. Panthers and Tigers combined. Around 8,500 average repair time for a Sherman. Less than 24 hours in the field. Average operational downtime for a Tiger. Up to 10 days. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real difference was psychological. By 1945, American tank crews had developed an unshakable faith in their machines and their mechanics. They knew that even if they were hit, even if their vehicle broke down, the Army would get them back into the fight. That trust, between men and machine, between front line and factory, became one of the most decisive factors in the Allied advance. Meanwhile, German morale eroded. Panzer crews often abandoned intact vehicles rather than risk immobility. The once feared German armored divisions, the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, were now reduced to defensive remnants, crippled by lack of support. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the final stage of the tank war was already decided. The Sherman, that mass-produced workhorse of democracy, was rolling over the remnants of an empire built on over-engineering and arrogance. The war had proven a harsh truth. In the mud, the snow, and the chaos of modern warfare, reliability was supremacy, and the Germans, who had once laughed at American mechanics, were now studying them, trying to understand how their enemies' machines had kept moving when theirs had died. Because, for the Americans, the war wasn't about building perfect tanks. It was about building tanks that could be fixed. That was the real genius of the Sherman. Not its gun, not its armor, but the hands that kept it alive. And in those hands, the tide of history had turned. As the American columns rolled across Germany in the spring of 1945, the Sherman tank had become more than a weapon. It was a statement of endurance, of ingenuity, and of a kind of quiet defiance that no amount of German engineering could match. The contrast between the two armies was now total. German tank units, once symbols of fear, were shadows of their former selves. Many tanks were abandoned without firing a shot. Some lacked fuel, others spare parts. The German war machine, once a legend of precision, had ground to a halt. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army had become a moving factory. Mobile repair depots followed every division, staffed by mechanics who could rebuild a transmission in under 6 hours. Damaged Shermans were dragged off the road, stripped for usable parts, and replaced almost instantly. It was an endless cycle of renewal. This efficiency extended all the way back to the American homeland. While Europe burned, Detroit still thundered, producing tanks, trucks, and engines at a rate the Axis could never match. For every destroyed Sherman, there were 5 more waiting on the docks. The result was inevitable. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine and swept into the heart of Germany, the Sherman led the charge. Town after town, river after river, the same machine that German officers once dismissed as primitive now rolled through the wreckage of the Reich. Its engine notes echoed across the ruins of what had once been Hitler's empire. A grim, mechanical hymn to the power of endurance. The Sherman's legacy was written not in glory, but in persistence. It was a tank that broke no records for firepower or armor, but it broke every record for reliability, availability, and adaptability. After the war, even the Germans acknowledged it. Engineers who had once designed Panthers and Tigers began studying the Sherman's production methods. In post-war interviews, many admitted that the American system had achieved something they never could: the perfect balance between simplicity and effectiveness. As Europe began to rebuild, thousands of surplus Shermans found new homes across the world. They fought in Korea, in the Middle East, and even into the 1960s, proof of their enduring design. Nations that could not afford the luxury of complexity found salvation in American practicality. The lessons were undeniable. In modern warfare, brilliance alone does not win. Sustainability does. The German laughter that had once echoed across muddy fields had long since turned to silence, replaced by the sound of engines that never stopped, turning for the men who kept those engines alive, the mechanics, engineers, drivers, and factory workers. The victory was not just military, it was industrial, human, and moral, because they proved that strength isn't measured by perfection, but by endurance through imperfection. The war in Europe would end within months, but the story of those rolling machines, and the men who refused to let them die, would live far longer. And as the last Sherman crossed into Germany, its treads grinding over the ruins of once invincible panzers, the world finally understood. In the mud of France and the snow of the Ardennes, America had redefined what it meant to build a weapon of war, not one that never failed, but one that could always be repaired. A philosophy born not from arrogance, but from resolve. A philosophy that would shape every machine, every army, every war to come. The laughter of the past was gone. In its place, the steady heartbeat of an engine that refused to stop. In the end, the story of the Sherman tank is not one of glamour or perfection. It is the story of endurance, of machines built to survive, repaired by human hands, and driven by willpower stronger than steel. The Germans sought mastery through complexity. The Americans found victory through simplicity. In that difference lay the defining truth of modern warfare. The most advanced weapon is useless without the system that sustains it. The Sherman was not the best tank on the battlefield. It did not have the thickest armor, the largest gun, or the most imposing silhouette. But it was the tank that was always there. When the mud thickened, when the snow fell, when engines froze, the Sherman moved. Every bolt, every engine block, every worn track plate told the same story, of a nation that understood that wars are not won by ideals of perfection, but by the relentless ability to adapt and endure. The laughter of German officers in those early days had come from confidence, from faith in precision. But by the war's end, that laughter had been replaced by awe, even respect, because they had witnessed something they hadn't believed possible. An army whose machines fought like living things, dying and rising again, unstoppable. The Sherman became more than a tank. It became a symbol of American ingenuity, of ordinary men and women working together across oceans, of the idea that progress is not beauty, but persistence. In the mud of Europe, among the ruins of over-designed empires, the truth rolled forward on steel treads and simple mechanics. Victory belonged not to the perfect, but to the ones who kept moving.